About a year ago, I was pretty new to the world of anime and manga. Of course, I had seen some stuff like Death Note, Neon Genesis Evangelion, Cowboy Bebop, Naruto, and Pokemon, and I was a bit familiar with Junji Ito's manga too, having read Uzumaki and some of his short stories. However, it was in 2022 that I properly started delving into manga properly, and in that time I've amassed a small collection which I'm really happy with. When I was looking for recommendations as to what to read next though, of course it wasn't long before I came across Berserk. Often rated as not only one of the best horror manga, but also one of the best manga ever written in general. I was already a tiny bit aware of Berserk after having watched the Golden Age arc movie trilogy, but I watched these quite a few years ago and I didn't remember a lot of the details. So I started collecting and reading the deluxe edition versions of the manga, and I've now got all 12 of these which are currently available, and I'll definitely be getting the final one when it's released soon too. Clearly, I quite like Berserk. If I didn't like it, then I wouldn't have spent so much money on all of these books. But it turns out that I actually really like Berserk. Way more than I ever expected to. From the characters and all of the different arcs they go through and how they change over time, the artwork which is just straight up unbelievable at times, the story which goes through so many twists and turns it's impossible to predict. It's just insanely good, and if you're a fan of dark fantasy or things which feature cosmic horror, body horror and graphic violence, while also being balanced out with character-driven moments which can often be light-hearted and some straight-up comedic moments too, I highly recommend it. After finishing all 12 of the deluxe edition versions of the manga though, it's got me wanting more. I've watched the 1997 anime, which is actually a really good adaptation of the Golden Age arc, even if it does miss out some key details and tone down the more graphic scenes. I've watched the Memorial Edition anime, which takes the trilogy of Golden Age arc movies and reformats them into a 13-episode series featuring brand new scenes. I've even started the 2016 anime, which covers the Conviction arc and half of the Millennium Falcon arc. I've heard that this particular adaptation is supposed to be quite bad, but I can't get enough Berserk. This of course led me to discovering that Berserk has a few video games out there. This shouldn't be too much of a surprise really, considering how popular of a series it's become. However, what did shock me was that despite the fact that Berserk has been published in Japan since 1990, it's only ever received 3 video game adaptations. The first of these is called Sword of the Berserk Guts' Rage, and its Japanese title is Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Flowers of Oblivion Chapter. This released in 1999 in Japan and 2000 in Europe and America. This is really interesting because the manga itself wasn't actually published in America until 2003, and the 1997 anime adaptation wasn't brought over until 2002, meaning that this video game was the first Berserk media ever to release in both America and the UK. I'm interested to know if there's anyone out there whose first experience with Berserk was with this video game. It's weird thinking that when this came out, it would have been experienced with no prior knowledge of the series, despite it being set basically in the middle of the story. It's at this point that I should probably state the obvious, that there's going to be some spoilers for Berserk ahead. While I will try and avoid any major details featured in the manga, because some of these games are direct adaptations of the manga or set during certain events, I can't avoid talking about some stuff. So if you're interested in Berserk and haven't read it yet and want to go in knowing as little as possible, you should probably stop the video here. For anyone else who doesn't care too much about the story or that's already read it though, let's talk about Sword of the Berserk. This game was actually released exclusively for the Dreamcast, which I think makes this the first Dreamcast game that I've ever played. I don't actually have a Dreamcast, so I had to emulate this, but I actually do want to get one soon, so if you have any game recommendations, let me know in the comments. Sword of the Berserk is set between volumes 22 and 23 of the manga, right after Guts starts his journey to Elfhelm with Casca and Puck. On the road, they happen to come across a group of bandits who are quickly killed by Guts after they threaten Casca and a nearby girl called Rita. Rita is a travelling performer and leads the group to a village where a member of the girl's troupe transforms into a monster who Guts quickly destroys. It's here that the leader of this village appears and tells them that there's been a strange plague spreading around and turning people into these monsters called Mandragorans. And you might be asking what the leader's name is. I mean, it's always polite to learn someone's name when you first meet them, so what is this guy's name?
Everyone stand back! Baron Balzac is here for an inspection!
I'm sorry, one of the major characters of this story is called what now?
I'm Balzac, ruler of this town.
Okay, yeah, I thought I heard that right. Baron Balzac is his name. What were they thinking with that? I get that maybe it's a direct translation of his Japanese name, but didn't anyone doing the English dub think to themselves, yeah, it's probably a good idea not to call this guy Balzac? Anyway, to cut a long story short here, Guts goes to Baron Balzac's castle and learns that there's a Mandragora plant which is causing the spreading infection and turning people into monsters. But the plant also has another side effect, which is that it can cure any illness. The Baron offers Guts a job, saying that if he can go into a Mandragora infested forest and get the heart of an adult plant, he will use his scientific knowledge to heal Casca, who has been in a regressive state since the events of the Golden Age arc. There's a hell of a lot that happens throughout the rest of the game, but to go into every detail would basically take up the rest of this video, so I'll just cut to the chase. Basically, at the end of the game, Baron Balzac is evil and is defeated by Guts before revealing he has a Behelit, and he uses this to become an apostle. For those uninitiated into the Berserk universe, apostles are basically former humans who have chosen to become demons after making some sort of sacrifice. And the tool that they use to do this is called a Behelit, which is basically one of these little round things with a disfigured face on it. Guts destroys Baron Balzac's apostle form, and Casca, who has just been temporarily possessed by the Mandragoran heart, actually appears to be recovered and speaks to Guts for the first time in years. Unfortunately though, she quickly reverts back to a regressed state again. The group end up leaving the castle and the town behind them, and that's when the Skull Knight appears, swallows Balzac's Behelit, and then trots away again. The Skull Knight is this character who keeps appearing in the series and sort of has this mysterious atmosphere around him. He's got sort of an unknown past, but he seems to be a good guy and helps Guts out at certain points in the story. Now, I've probably not really done the story of Sword of the Berserk any justice here because of how quickly I've needed to speed through it. There's way more that happens and loads of side characters get introduced, and we even get a flashback sequence showing the backstory of a certain character which features original artwork made by the late Kantaro Miura. This is of course the creator and writer of the Berserk manga, so this was awesome to see. I wonder if these illustrations exist anywhere in a higher quality. They must have had a physical form at some point when they were originally drawn, so I wonder what happened to them. The gameplay itself is a hack and slash style affair. You have a quick attack, strong attack, slide kick, jump, which can be combined with your attacks. You can put your sword away, which gives you access to a punching moveset and Guts' arm-mounted crossbow, and you even have access to some items which are activated by holding a trigger and then pressing one of the face buttons. These include Elf Dust, which heals you, bombs which can be thrown a short distance in front of you before exploding, throw-in knives which have a longer range than the bombs but deal hardly any damage, and of course, one of Guts' most iconic weapons, the arm-mounted cannon. Already I'm very impressed by the variety of combat options on display here. This really helps to keep every encounter fresh, and it can actually feel quite tactical choosing which option is the best for each encounter. Sometimes the best option is to actually just ignore the enemies and run past them when you're heavily outnumbered, but sometimes you're locked into situations where that isn't possible and you have to fight your way through. Another thing I love about this game is how satisfying it is to swing the sword around. It feels really weighty and responsive, and the chunky sound effects of hitting into armor or flesh depending on the enemy really adds to the feedback that you get as a player. It feels like you're an incredibly powerful swordsman, which is great. An element of of the gameplay I don't like though is that when you've killed enough enemies, you'll enter a rage mode, but rather than allowing you to manually activate this at an opportune moment, it'll instead just automatically activate when the gauge is full, which can lead to going into the mode when there's hardly any enemies left. Another quite irritating mechanic is that because Guts' sword is so big and the levels will sometimes consist of extremely tight areas, you'll be clanging off of walls pretty much constantly. I don't know if this was added to make you more reliant on punching enemies and using your side weapons, but it's honestly pretty annoying. You can also find yourself getting stun locked quite often, which makes the game seem a lot harder than it actually should be. You can lose a lot of health from a tiny group of enemies if you get unlucky, and it can end up making the game feel a bit unfair. Despite its downfalls though, I have to admit, even as someone who normally doesn't like this type of game at all, I actually really liked this. The levels are always fairly short and each one is visually varied and features different types of enemies to fight. The story is actually really fleshed out and it actually has a hell of a lot of cutscenes. Kentaro Miura is even credited as one of the writers of the game, and I think that you can tell that this is the case. The characters here are a lot more complex than simply being either good or evil, and they all have understandable motives behind their actions, which keeps it interesting to experience. There's even a small amount of gameplay variety featured here too, with not only having the arena-like sections where you need to kill a bunch of enemies to open the way forward, but more explorative areas where you can try and run past enemies to find items to refill your side weapon ammo. On top of that though, there's even a boulder chase sequence later on where you need to outrun a huge mandragoran plant, and perhaps even more interestingly than that, there's even some quick time events here too, where you're watching a cutscene and you'll need to quickly press a button that appears on the screen. Sometimes the result of getting this wrong or not hitting the button fast enough is just that you'll die. But the more interesting way this is used is that sometimes if you mess up, you'll end up falling off of a bridge or something, and you'll end up in a different area of the level than what you would have if you did the quick time event successfully. This adds some replay value too, because in order to experience everything the game has to offer, you would need to fail and succeed in the quick time events. Another thing to point out is that this game came out in 1999, just before the release of Shenmue, which is the game credited with popularizing and even naming the QuickTime event. So really, Sword of the Berserk is the true QuickTime event pioneer. I mean, give it the credit it deserves, people. The final bit of variety on offer is with the boss battles, and these, to be honest, probably could have been a bit better. The visual designs of them are fantastic, but the actual execution of them leaves a bit to be desired. Basically the main issue is that there's no lock-on feature, but on top of that I feel like Guts should have had a much faster dodge ability, which potentially gave you invincibility frames too. You can dodge to a certain extent with a sidestepping ability, but when the bosses are these massive demons, it doesn't do very much, and it can feel like you just have to tank hits at certain points. There's an absolutely huge difficulty spike when you get to the boss fight against a character called Zod too. I legitimately had to turn the difficulty down in order to beat him. I can't even imagine how tough it must be on hard mode. I do wish that there was a little bit more to do in this game though, like maybe some bits where there's no enemies and you just explore and solve puzzles, or maybe do some platforming or something. Luckily this isn't too much of an issue though, considering that the game is extremely short, but a bit more variety would have gone a long way. So yeah, overall, Sword of the Berserk Guts' Rage is actually very good. I'll be wanting to pick this up properly if I get myself a Dreamcast at some point, because it would be a fun one to replay. It has a few little issues, sure, but the positives definitely outweigh the negatives, and it's also really interesting from a story perspective because this is a canon, completely original tale that isn't covered in the manga or anywhere else. It is slightly debated whether the game is completely canon, but as far as I've read, there's nothing that contradicts anything in the game, so it can just be seen as a nice little side story that doesn't affect the main plot. The second video game based on Berserk is actually somewhat of a direct sequel to Sword of the Berserk, being made by the same developer and featuring very similar gameplay. This one is called Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Holy Evil War Chapter and released on the PS2. Instead of creating an original story, it adapts the actual manga into a video game. This is the only one of the 3 games that never released outside of Japan too, and I suspect the reason for this is that the game released in 2004 and adapts the first half of the Millennium Falcon arc. But the English release of this portion of the manga didn't release until 2008, meaning that it wouldn't make any sense story-wise to anybody in the West. In 2004, we were still in the early days of the Golden Age arc, having just met Zod for the first time, so we were way behind with the events of Berserk. Because this game follows the manga, it makes it potentially a little bit less interesting to talk about. Basically, this game is about what happens after Guts, Casca and Puck set out to travel to Elfhelm and end up reuniting with Farnese, Serpico and Isidro after the events of the Conviction arc. This is also where we get introduced to Shirek and Avalora, who were brand new characters at the time. I'm probably not pronouncing Shirek's name right, but I've only encountered this character in the manga, so I'm not sure how to say it properly. Of course though, things don't go smoothly along the way for the group, and they end up encountering snow monsters, trolls, and all sorts of nasty demons. The most interesting thing about this game is that they added in a new side story which isn't present in the manga, and it's about a kid called Charles who is an apostle that can manifest memories of people and turn them against you. This results in several battles that Guts has with his old comrades from the Band of the Hawk, having you fight Judo, Pippin, Corcus, and later on even Casca and Griffith, which is a good way of including those characters without making a game about the Golden Age arc. Later on you even fight Charles directly, both as his human form and his apostle form, which is awesome. Like I said earlier, the gameplay in a lot of ways is very similar to Sword of the Berserk. You no longer have the ability to put away your sword, slide kick, or even jump, but these things are replaced with some new mechanics instead. So firstly, the rage mode from the original game returns, but this time you can manually activate it, a good addition to the game. The sub-weapons at your disposal are all the same, but this time they don't rely on ammo and instead have a cooldown timer. I'm a bit mixed on this personally, because the issue here is that it basically means that there's no reason to explore anymore because there's no ammo to find, and it hasn't really been replaced by anything of any worth. You have a new instant kill move which activates after you've hit enemies a certain number of times. When this is active, you'll see the brand of sacrifice appear in the corner of the screen, and by doing a strong attack, you'll instead perform a fatality move which deals a lot of damage to bosses, or straight up insta-kills any smaller enemies. There's now a set of 4 comrades which you can utilise in fights too, and these operate basically exactly like the sub-weapons, being on a cooldown timer once you've used them. One is the replacement for the elf dust, being Puck himself who will heal you, Serpico will freeze time for a short while, Isidro will use his fire dagger to set the area around you ablaze, and Shirek will heighten your defense for you. On top of all of this, you also have a much better dodge ability this time, although I do feel like it's a bit underpowered because you have to recover for a short while after each dodge, which makes it feel a bit janky. And you also have a brand new counter and reprisal system, where if you block just before an enemy hits you, you'll enter a counter animation where you perform a move on them which deals a lot of damage. Or if you press block just after being hit, you'll instead do a reprisal move which hits the enemy back after they've hit you. Still dealing damage, but not as much as the counter does. There's even an experience system this time too, where by chaining together large combos or by killing bosses, you'll gain experience points which can be used either in save areas or at the end of each level to improve your stats. There's loads of things to invest in here, such as making cooldown timers faster, improving your strong attack, making your standard sword swings faster, giving you more health, and things like that. This is great for incentivizing killing as many enemies as possible, but I do feel like you should have potentially gotten more experience through the game, because I only had enough to level up 2 things to the max, as well as invest some points into a few other things too. Considering the amount of things that you can level up, it would have been nice to have actually been able to utilize some of it a bit more. So yeah, it's safe to say that they've taken the combat system from Sword of the Berserk and really honed down on it, making it even more varied and complex than it was before, and just like with the last game, it feels great. You always feel like you have options in combat, and it keeps each encounter feeling really fresh and satisfying. When you start chaining together the rage mode with the instant kill attack and the sub-weapons, you'll feel like some kind of beast. It's amazing. The single best thing about this entire game though is that the feedback you get from all of these attacks is absolutely incredible. So you know how in Sword of the Berserk you'll slash at an enemy, blood will come out, and then there's a chonky sound effect which makes it feel awesome? This game dials things up even more. Not only doing all of that, but realistically dismembering or literally cutting enemies apart. Like if you do a downward slash at an enemy and hit them in the middle, they will actually split open vertically. If you miss slightly, you'll end up cutting off their arm and they'll still be alive but not have the weapon they were holding. If you slash horizontally, you'll split them in two from the waist and watch the top half go flying away. I've never seen this amount of accuracy of dismemberment ever before in a game this old. I thought this was the sort of thing that was only possible with the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, with games like Dead Space and Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance being marketed because of the dismemberment mechanics. But here's a Berserk game released way before those on a previous gen console doing the same thing. I'm very impressed by this, and it makes the combat feel so great. There's even a lock-on system for the boss fights this time too, although I do admit that this can be a little bit clunky because sometimes it'll just unlock from the enemy and be difficult to lock back on again, but hey, this is another example of an area where they improved from the first game. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that despite all of the praise I've had for the game so far, there's a hell of a lot of areas where this game falls flat, and it actually turns out that despite all of the improvements made to the first game, this in my opinion is nowhere near as good. The biggest problem is that there's practically no variety in gameplay. There's basically two things that you'll be doing outside of a few very select examples. One of these things is arena combat, where you need to kill all of the enemies to progress. This is where the game shines and the combat mechanics are at the forefront of the experience. The second type of gameplay is where you'll be running down corridors, avoiding all of the enemies, and reaching some kind of arbitrary objective before running down more corridors to get to the next objective. So for example, in this level you need to run around the map, get into these enemy base camps, and then killing all of the enemies. This is fine on paper, but all you're doing between the bases is running down straight paths with absolutely nothing to do but either kill or avoid the endlessly spawning enemies. So between the actual combat encounters, you'll either be taking part in literally never-ending combat in a corridor, or running past all of the enemies in a corridor. It's really, really boring and tedious, and this game needed something else to do. There's literally only a handful of moments where something remotely interesting happens while you're traversing the world. There's this bit where these trolls are rolling boulders down a hill at you which you need to avoid. This bit where you need to destroy this rock from two sides in order to make a path forward. And this bit which features a teleporting maze where you'll get taken back to the start if you take the wrong path. I guess there's also this bit where you walk around a town talking to people before more enemies show up, but that's almost as tedious as the normal gameplay really. Outside of those few examples, all you're doing is running down repetitive corridors for ages, going past all of the enemies because there's literally no point in fighting them due to them infinitely spawning. Bear in mind too that each level here will take upwards of an entire hour due to how stupidly tedious they made them. There's this level where you need to go around the map saving villagers, and instead of having like maybe 3 of them, they make you rescue 6 of them, each with their own enemy horde to destroy. And then after that you need to partake in even more enemy hordes in front of a church. It's like all there is to the game is enemy horde after enemy horde, and in between there's just corridors of enemies. It gets so boring. There are boss battles of course, and honestly these are probably the highlight of the game outside of the core combat being really good, even if it is massively overused. There's a lot of variety here both mechanically and visually, and certain bosses have unique aspects to separate them from normal enemies too. Like there's this Kelpie boss which has a shield of water and it can only be hit if it's taken off guard with a sub-weapon or a companion. Then there's this fight against Slan where you need to destroy her wings which are acting as a shield before doing damage to her directly. Then there's the apostle form of Charles which can actually fly around, and while it's in the air it can only be hit with ranged attacks. The bosses are really where you'll need to make use of the counter system, because some of them have a ton of health and can also attack you way faster than you can dodge them. This countering system is such a good idea, but it feels a little bit random at times as to when you're actually supposed to press the block button. Sometimes I felt like I pressed it perfectly and I didn't get a counter, but then other times I pressed it way too late or early and it gave me the counter anyway. It's a little bit inconsistent, and I feel like the bosses could have had more telegraphed attacks to allow you to properly counter them in a satisfying way. If you're expecting Sekiro levels of precision here, I'm sorry to disappoint. Overall though, that's basically how I would sum up my experience with this game. Disappointing. The actual combat system here and the animations of the enemies and Guts himself are jaw-droppingly good. Something else impressive I didn't mention was how if you attack in one direction and then move the analog stick in a different direction to attack behind you or to the side of you, Guts will actually smoothly transition into a directional attack in the direction that you're holding the stick, performing a unique sword swing depending on his position. This is yet another way that they made the combat feel buttery smooth, and it's genuinely impressive. It's just let down by the fact that the combat is literally all the game has going for it. There's nothing of value outside of that, and the moments where you aren't partaking in combat and you just run into the next objective are tedious beyond belief. The levels should have been way shorter, and the running from objective to objective should have been replaced with more interesting exploration sections with way better level design, maybe some platforming sequences, or even some puzzle elements. The level design in general is so much worse than in the original game too, with that game often featuring areas with a degree of verticality that made them feel like you were fighting through real places, whereas here, it's either an open arena or a corridor. It's not interesting to move through this game's world, which is very unfortunate. The final game we have left to talk about is far newer than these previous two, being released in 2016 in Japan and only a year later in 2017 for the rest of the world. This one is also available on modern day platforms too. You can get it on PS4 and PC right now, and it's even on the PS Vita and weirdly released on the PS3 too, but only in Japan. This is Berserk and the Band of the Hawk, also known as Berserk Musou in Japan, with Musou referring to the popular Warriors franchise, consisting of Dynasty Warriors, Samurai Warriors, and more. The Warriors series has recently become known for its collaborations with other series, probably most notably the Hyrule Warriors games, which is a mixture of the Warriors style, but with the Legend of Zelda characters and worlds. Omega Force, the developers of the Warriors games, are no strangers to tackling manga and anime titles either. They've done collaborations with Fist of the North Star and One Piece already, and now they're here to tackle Berserk. Obviously this game is very different to the previous ones that we've talked about, not only being way more modern, but also not even having the same developer. I do wonder if the developer of the original Berserk games, Yuke's, ever intended to do more Berserk games in their style. After all, they never actually finished adapting the Millennium Falcon arc, with the second game finishing around the halfway point of the entire arc. I suspect that they intended to at least finish this particular arc and have the games be a trilogy. After all, the first game was called Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Flowers of Oblivion chapter in Japan, and the second game was called Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Holy Evil War chapter, meaning that they clearly intended these to be considered parts 1 and 2 of a series, given the similar titles. I wonder why they never ended up doing a third game. Anyway, Berserk and the Band of the Hawk is of course a Warriors style game. Basically this means that the standout gimmick here is that there's absolutely loads of enemies on the battlefield, and you have to slice and dice through them to reach points of interest, such as a particular objective to defend or attack, or a powerful enemy commander, or even a boss character to defeat. Potentially one of the most interesting things about this game is that unlike with the previous ones we've looked at, which either create an original story or tackle a small portion of an arc from the manga, this game attempts to tell the entire story of the manga up until the Fantasia arc, which they probably didn't tackle due to it not being finished at the time, and kinda depressingly, it's still not finished to this day. Although new chapters are now being made by Miura's friend Koji Mori, who is the only person who knew the ending to Berserk as told by Miura himself, and Studio Gaga, the team of artists gathered by Miura himself in order to assist with Berserk. What this means though is that this game is potentially the most complete way of experiencing the Berserk story outside of the manga itself, with the Golden Age arc films and the 1997 anime only covering the Golden Age arc, and the 2016 anime only covering the Conviction and half of the Millennium Falcon arc. Rather strangely, outside of this game, the very first arc of the manga, the Black Swordsman arc, has never been adapted, despite in my opinion being pretty integral to the story. I mean, the first episode of the 1997 anime gave us an extremely abridged version of the arc, but this can hardly be considered a proper adaptation. One noticeably strange thing about this game is that it uses this odd mixture of in-engine cutscenes with pre-rendered cutscenes with movie clips taken from the Golden Age arc trilogy. This creates a really inconsistent tone because the story is being told in so many different ways. It's not distracting to the point where it's completely off-putting, but it is weird how they didn't just go with one type of cutscene. The clips taken from the Golden Age arc trilogy can actually be quite lengthy too, and the game apparently features over 120 minutes worth of footage from the films. Considering that the first film is only 77 minutes long on its own, this is a hell of a lot of footage to use. I mean, you're basically just watching the films at that point, but just with gameplay in between. Of course though, once the Golden Age arc is wrapped up, this left the developers with no more footage to use, so after the Golden Age, they only used the in-engine cutscenes and the pre-rendered cutscenes. But this still does a decent enough job of covering all of the events in the manga. It does skip out on quite a lot of details, but considering how long it would have to be 100% accurate to the manga, that makes sense. In a lot of ways, this game is easily the best out of the three. I mean, it tells the whole story of Berserk, at least pretty much outside of the Fantasia arc. It's by far the most manga-accurate adaptation of the series we've ever seen, and the gameplay itself is pretty solid. The gist of the game boils down to selecting a particular mission and then building up your kill and combo count to gain access to more powerful moves. The more enemies you slaughter, the more a rage meter will build up, and when you finally unleash it, you'll be far more powerful and you'll start filling up a second meter, which will allow you to pull off a devastating special attack. Later in the game, you even gain access to the Berserker armor, which feels awesome. The overall issue with this game though is that there's not too much going on. It almost mimics my issue with the second game, but in a lot of ways it's kind of even worse. Almost every single mission feels exactly the same, and even when there is something slightly different going on, like having to pay attention to your teammates' health as you split up and they go and tackle one objective while you do another, it doesn't really actually affect anything. You just cut down thousands upon thousands of enemies with basic combos consisting of a mixture of light and heavy attacks, and even though I was playing on the hard difficulty, they never even put up a fight. It's just extremely mindless, and I don't actually think this style of game suits Berserk very much. Guts is shown to kill 100 enemies in a part of the manga, but the result of that is that he's on the verge of dying. The combat is shown to take its toll on the characters, and it's much more tactical than just cutting through everything in your path. Whereas in this game, Guts is killing literally thousands of enemies and not even breaking a sweat. It's just a bit weird. There's also this rudimentary crafting system where you can equip characters with different things to affect their stats in different ways, but honestly this is so basic that it just feels unnecessary. I like the leveling up system, which gives you a constant feeling of progression, but the item management side of things probably wasn't needed on top of that. Also, the leveling up in this game just alters your stats automatically, so you could argue that it's worse than in the second game where you actually had a degree of customization over your stats. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on the game though, because it was reasonably fun, far too long considering the lack of variety, but fun in short bursts. I think the highlights of the game were actually the boss battles, where it's just a one-on-one fight against a certain apostle from the series. This is the only time where I actually needed to think about what I was doing and use my sub-weapons in creative ways. It's also the only time where dodging and blocking is actually really useful too, so I think more of these battles would have been interesting rather than it consisting mostly of hordes of enemies. Another great thing about this game is that you can play as more than just Guts, with Casca, Griffith and Judo being playable in the Golden Age, and Serpico and Shire-Eek being playable in the later arcs. You even unlock characters like Zard and Wild too, although these are only usable in the free play mode that the game offers. The issue with this is that for most of the game, you're obviously going to be using Guts. This is because for a large chunk of the game, he's the only character that's actually playable, considering that he's on his own. But even when you do have the option of playing as someone else, why would you when you could be getting Guts more experience to level him up and make him stronger? There's never a point where you can't play as Guts, which I actually think is a missed opportunity. Like, it could have been a pretty dramatic bit if Guts got removed from play after being separated from the group, or he couldn't move because of how injured he is or something, and you had to fight as another character who's hugely underleveled, and it could have organically shown just how vital Guts is to the group because of how powerful he's become. Kind of unfortunate that nothing like that ever happens. Just like with the other games we've talked about, this is in desperate need of some variety. The world of Berserk is so well crafted, visually interesting and diverse, that it's weird that a game has never properly taken advantage of that and allowed us to explore it. All of these games seem to be too focused on combat, and Berserk is much more than that. You could make an argument that the best Berserk game isn't even an official Berserk game, and is in fact Dark Souls. The Dark Souls series, Bloodborne, Demon Souls, Elden Ring and Sekiro included, are all extremely heavily inspired by Berserk and do a much better job of adapting the sort of combat that you see in the Berserk manga to a game. It's much more deliberate and each encounter is dangerous, just like it would be in the universe of Berserk. The dream would be that From Software, the studio behind the Souls games, one day got to work on an official Berserk game. But to be honest, I also think that there's other game studios out there that could do an amazing job as well. Like this Santa Monica studio, who are the team behind the recent God of War games, who would do an amazing job. Again, the combat and the general moment-to-moment gameplay in those games would suit Berserk much more than a typical hack-and-slash game. Whether we actually get another Berserk game at all though is kind of up in the air at this point. I think the best thing to do might just be to wait for the manga to completely finish before any other adaptations begin. But just thinking about everything that would be possible with a really good Berserk game is super interesting. I mean, I even think a Berserk game where you don't play as Guts could be interesting. Maybe you could play as a completely original character who becomes an apostle hunter for some reason, and then you could explore parts of the world that we haven't seen yet. That could be really interesting and would avoid directly messing with the characters from the main series. If I was to say which of these three official games are the best though, I would definitely say that Sword of the Berserk Guts' Rage is the best. The combat is satisfying, it has more going on with its gameplay than the other games, with its quick time events and sections that don't revolve around combat. The story is original and seemingly canon, or at least semi-canon to the manga, which gives you something to experience even if you've read through the entire thing already. It features original art by Miura, and it just feels the most authentic to the Berserk universe too. Maybe because Miura had direct involvement with the game's development. As well as that, it's also reasonably short, which I think works for hack-and-slash games much better than them being too long. And it's got Baron Ballsack, so it automatically wins. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Berserk video game adaptations. Let me know if you've played any of these and which one you liked the most. If you did enjoy the video, give it a like and subscribe for more stuff like this coming soon, and I'll see you next time. Bye!